From the sea, the mist rolls in, wrapping the small coastal village of Minamatata in a ghostly shroud. It is 1961, and Japan is changing rapidly, industrializing, modernizing. But here, in this forgotten corner of Kyushu Island, time moves differently. Like barnacles to a ship's hull, traditions cling to the wooden houses. As readily as greetings, superstitions are whispered between neighbors. Welcome to the Ghastly Journal. I'm your narrator, and tonight I bring you the tale of the Nakamura twins, Akira and Akio. Mirror reflections of each other, identical in every way, who came to believe they were not two separate beings, but a single soul inhabiting two physical forms. Everything you thought you knew about identity, connection, and the boundaries of human consciousness will be challenged by their story. Before we begin, I must emphasize that what follows is a work of fiction. Only in the realm of imagination do the characters and events depicted exist, crafted to explore the darker corners of human psychology and belief. On a night much like this one, pregnant with possibilities, shrouded in mist, our story begins. On the outskirts of Minamata, where the mountains meet the sea, the Nakamura family lived in a traditional house. A fisherman weathered by salt and sun, Hiroshi Nakamura's hands were permanently creased from years of nets and ropes. Throughout the village, his wife Yuko was known for her quiet strength and her knowledge of old remedies, herbs and poultices, and whispered incantations that seemed to heal what modern medicine could not. The village celebrated when Yukio announced she was pregnant. The older residents exchanged worried glances when her belly grew large enough to suggest twins. In their lineage, twins were rare, and in the old beliefs, they were often seen as an omen, sometimes of prosperity, but more often of something else, something unsettling that couldn't quite be named. Over the bay, as thunder cracked and fishing boats strained against their moorings on a stormy night in April 1961, Yukio gave birth to identical twin boys. Old Mrs. Tanaka, the midwife, noticed something immediately, but said nothing until the babies were cleaned and swaddled. "Look," she finally whispered to Hiroshi, who hovered nervously nearby. "They are mirror twins indeed." Indeed, while the boys were identical in face and form, they were opposite in subtle ways. Born first, Akira was right-handed. Akio, who followed 7 minutes later, favored his left. Behind his right ear, Akira had a small birthmark. Behind his left, Akio's matching mark was. In opposite directions from their crowns, their hair even swirled. "It is rare," Mrs. Tanaka said. "In the old days, we would say their souls were split at birth. One soul that became two, or perhaps two souls that longed to be one." Hiroshi dismissed this as superstition, but Yukio kept the midwife's words locked in her heart, watching her boys with careful eyes as they grew. Normally, for the first few years, the twins developed. They were healthy, curious children who delighted the village with their matching faces and opposite mannerisms. But as they approached their third birthday, Yukio began noticing strange behaviors. Without looking, as if choreographed, the twins would sometimes mirror each other's movements. Akio would cry out in pain, clutching his own uninjured knee when Akira fell and scraped his knee. A complicated system of sounds and gestures that only they understood, they developed their own language. The local doctor assured the parents this wasn't unusual for twins. But those who witnessed it were unsettled by something in the intensity of their connection. On dressing identically, but in reverse, the twins insisted by age 5. As was traditional for boys, if Akira wore his jacket button from right to left, Akio would insist on wearing his buttoned left to right. For hours, they would stand before mirrors, fascinated by how their reflections seemed to break the mirroring pattern. From Akio, despite the boys themselves being mirror images of each other, Akira's reflection had his part on the opposite side. Around this time, they first began speaking of being the same person. "We are not two," they would say in unison, their voices blending into an eerie singularity. "We are one split in half." Their parents tried to discourage this talk. Rapidly modernizing, Japan made such mystical ideas seem out of place in the new world of science and progress. Especially Hiroshi worried about his sons fitting into society. But the more they tried to separate the twins, the more fiercely they clung to their shared identity. To Minamata, a new doctor came when the boys were 7. Dr. Yoshida, young and educated in Tokyo with modern ideas about psychology and child development. Hiroshi and Yukio brought the twins to see him, concerned about their son's intensifying bond. The Nakamura twins fascinated Dr. Yoshida. He had read Western literature on identical twins and their unique psychological development, but the mirror aspect added a dimension he hadn't encountered before. Weekly, he began meeting with the boys, sometimes together, sometimes separately, making careful notes about their behaviors and beliefs. To the parents after several sessions, he explained, the bond between identical twins is naturally strong. They share not just genes, but prenatal experiences. Even more unusual are mirror twins. They essentially develop as reflections of each other. It's not surprising they've developed this mythology about themselves. Voicing the fear that had been growing in her heart, Yukio asked, "But is it healthy?" Dr. Yoshida hesitated. "I believe we should gently guide them toward a more conventional understanding of their separate identities. Perhaps begin by separating them more. Different classes at school, different activities." A concerted effort to help the twins develop as individuals began. When they began school, they were placed in separate classrooms. On the weekends, Hiroshi took Akira fishing while Yukio taught Akio to help in her garden. Different clothes, different toys they were given. With increasing distress, the twins responded. They became withdrawn. Their academic performance suffered and they developed mysterious physical symptoms. Stomach aches, headaches, night terrors that seemed to strike them simultaneously, even when they were apart. Most disturbing was their insistence that they could feel each other's physical sensations and emotions even at a distance. Akio would come home crying, able to recount exactly what had happened if Akira was scolded at school. Akira would suddenly wince and check his own finger despite being nowhere near the house if Akio cut his finger helping his mother in the kitchen. An elaborate belief system about their condition had been developed by the twins by their 10th birthday. They told Dr. Yoshida that they weren't actually twins at all, but a single person whose soul had been divided between two bodies. During a session that the doctor recorded on a bulky reel-to-reel tape machine, Akio explained, "In the spirit world, we are one. But here, we were split apart at birth." Akira continued, "And that's why we feel what the other feels, and know what the other knows. Because we're not really separate." Dr. Yoshida asked, "And what happens when you grow up? Will you always need to be together?" Their identical brown eyes meeting in that peculiar way they had, as if seeing through each other, the twins looked at each other. In unison, they said, "We will become one again." In his journal that night, Dr. Yoshida noted that the twins' delusion, as he had come to see it, was becoming more entrenched rather than less. Despite his efforts, they were retreating further into their shared identity rather than developing healthy individual selves. More aggressive intervention he recommended. It was decided that the twins would be separated entirely for a month. With their maternal grandmother in a neighboring village, Akio would stay while Akira remained at home. The hope was that this complete separation would weaken their unusual bond and help them develop as individuals. From the start, the separation was traumatic. Both boys became physically ill as soon as they were parted, developing high fevers and becoming delirious. More disturbing still, they reported identical hallucinations, visions of dark water, a submerged village, and ghostly twins reaching for each other across an impassable barrier. After 3 days, against Dr. Yoshida's advice, Yukio insisted on reuniting them. Their fevers broke and they clung to each other, whispering in their private language for hours the moment the twins saw each other. Disturbed but fascinated, Dr. Yoshida was. He began researching cases of twins with unusually strong psychic connections, finding scattered reports throughout the medical literature, but nothing that matched the intensity of what he was observing with the Nakamura twins. Meanwhile, the situation in Minamata was changing. For years, industrial pollution had been seeping into the bay, poisoning the fish and consequently the villagers who depended on them for food. Strange illnesses were appearing. tremors, vision problems, loss of coordination. The government investigation was just beginning, but rumors spread through the village like wildfire. Against this backdrop of growing community fear, the twins' behavior took another unsettling turn. Now 11 years old, they began speaking of dreams they shared. Identical nightmares of poisoned water and deformed spirits. They claimed these spirits were trying to communicate with them, to warn the village through them. Akira told his increasingly worried mother, "The spirits are angry because they've been split apart too. Like us." Akio continued, "They were one with the water and the fish and the people, but now they're broken and separated." Disturbing pictures, identical images created simultaneously, even when they were in different rooms, the twins began drawing. The drawings showed distorted human figures emerging from dark water, their limbs twisted, their faces melting like reflections in rippling pools. As a response to the community's anxiety about the pollution, Dr. Yoshida tried to explain the twins' behavior, but privately he was shaken. There were elements of their shared consciousness that he couldn't explain away through conventional psychology. As the twins approached their 12th birthday, they became increasingly preoccupied with mirrors. They collected them, arranged them in complex configurations in their room, and spent hours staring into them, having whispered conversations with their reflections that they refused to explain to their parents. One day, Hiroshi returned from fishing to find his son sitting perfectly still, facing each other with a small hand mirror between them, positioned so that each could see the other's reflection rather than their own. They didn't respond to his voice or his touch. Their eyes were open but unseeing. So slow was their breathing he initially feared they weren't breathing at all. Hours it took to break them from this trance-like state. And when they finally came back to awareness, they were confused and disoriented, unable to explain what had happened. Their parents were frightened enough by this incident that they took the extreme step of removing all mirrors from the house. That night, the twins slept peacefully for the first time in months. But when Yukio went to wake them in the morning, she found their beds empty. Through the household, then the neighborhood, then the entire village, panic spread as a search party was organized. At dusk, the twins were discovered, standing hand in hand at the edge of the bay, the polluted water lapping at their feet. They were unharmed, but seemed dazed, speaking only to each other in their private language. When Dr. Yoshida was called to examine them, they finally spoke in Japanese, saying only, "We found the way back to one." Alarmed by this incident and the twins' increasingly detached behavior, Dr. Yoshida recommended they be taken to a specialized hospital in Tokyo for evaluation. Modern psychiatry, he suggested, might offer treatments that could help the boys develop healthier, separate identities. Hiroshi and Yukio were reluctant. Taking the twins to Tokyo meant admitting their condition was beyond the help of local medicine or traditional remedies. It meant exposing their family's struggles to outsiders. But their fear for their son's well-being finally outweighed these concerns, and arrangements were made for the twins to be admitted to a prestigious psychiatric hospital in the capital. From the sea, a violent storm swept in the night before they were to leave for Tokyo. Rain lashed the village and wind howled through the narrow streets. In the chaos of preparing for the journey and securing their home against the storm, Hiroshi and Yukio didn't immediately notice that the twins had slipped away again. This time they had taken something with them, an antique mirror that had belonged to Yukio's grandmother, supposedly blessed by a Shinto priest to show not just reflections, but glimpses of the spirit world. Since the incident by the bay, it had been locked in a storeroom, but somehow the twins had found it. No trace of the boys was found by the search party that night. As dawn broke and the storm subsided, leaving the village mud-soaked and strewn with debris, the search expanded. Police were called from the neighboring town. For 3 days, every building, every boat, every cave along the shoreline was examined. On the 4th day, a fisherman spotted something unusual in a tidal pool at the base of the cliffs outside the village. The antique mirror, somehow undamaged, resting on a flat rock as if carefully placed there. Of the twins, there was no sign. After 2 weeks, the official search was called off. The police report listed the Nakamura twins as presumed drowned, their bodies likely carried out to sea by the strong currents. For months, Hiroshi continued searching, taking his boat out daily to scour the coastline. While Yukio consulted psychics and traditional healers, desperate for any information about her sons. Troubled by the case and his own inability to help the twins, Dr. Yoshida left Minamata shortly after their disappearance to take a position at a research hospital in Osaka. But before leaving, he gave his case notes and recordings to Yukio, telling her that perhaps someday they might help make sense of what had happened. Years passed. The truth about the industrial pollution in Minamata Bay finally came to light, and the resulting illness, mercury poisoning from contaminated fish, became known internationally as Minamata disease. The village changed, with many residents relocating and new people moving in as the area slowly recovered. Hiroshi and Yukio remained, growing older in their house by the sea, never giving up hope that their sons might somehow return. They kept the boys' room exactly as it had been, dust gathering on the paired desks where the twins had drawn their mirrored pictures. In 1972, 11 years after the twins' disappearance, a young anthropologist named Kenji Tanaka came to Minamata to document the cultural impact of the industrial disaster. While interviewing elderly residents about traditional beliefs and how they intersected with the modern tragedy, he heard whispered stories about the mirror twins who had vanished during the storm. Intrigued, Tanaka sought out the Nakamura family. Hiroshi had died the previous winter, but Yukio still lived in the old house, now in her 60s, but still sharp-minded and willing to share her story. She showed Tanaka her son's drawings, played him the scratchy recordings of Dr. Yoshida's sessions, and finally, hesitantly told him about the strange occurrences that had followed the twins' disappearance. "Sometimes when I look in a mirror too long," she confided, "I see them, not as they were, but as they would be now, young men, still identical, still mirrored. They're trying to tell me something, but I can't understand them without the proper mirror." Skeptical, but fascinated, Tanaka was. He asked about the antique mirror that had been found at the tidal pool. "It was returned to me," Yukio said, "but it changed. The glass darkened and sometimes it doesn't show reflections at all, only darkness. I keep it covered now." Despite his academic skepticism, Tanaka asked to see this mirror. Yukio led him to a small room at the back of the house where the mirror hung on the wall covered with a piece of indigo cloth. With trembling hands, she removed the covering. Unusually large for a Japanese household item of its era, the mirror was almost a meter tall in an ornate wooden frame carved with waves and sea creatures. The glass was indeed darkened, as if tarnished, but in a peculiar way that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. "It's quite beautiful," Tanaka said, stepping closer. "May I?" Yukio nodded and he leaned in to examine the craftsmanship of the frame. As he did, he caught a flicker of movement in the glass. Not his own reflection, which was strangely absent, but a rippling like water disturbed by something moving beneath its surface. He jerked back, telling himself it was a trick of the light. But then he saw it again. Faces forming briefly in the darkness of the mirror. Identical young men with serious eyes, their features almost, but not quite those of the twins from the photographs he'd been shown. They appeared to be underwater, reaching toward the glass from the inside. Backward, Tanaka stumbled, his academic detachment shattered. Yukio showed no surprise at his reaction. "They're still trying to become one," she said quietly. "They haven't found the way yet." Shaken, Tanaka cut his research trip short and returned to Tokyo, taking with him copies of Dr. Yoshida's notes and recordings. He intended to write about the case from a folkloric perspective. How traditional beliefs about twins and spirits had colored the community's understanding of the tragedy. But every time he tried to work on the manuscript, he found himself disturbed by unexplainable phenomena. His own reflection seeming to move independently. Water inexplicably pooling under the windows of his apartment during dry weather. Dreams of drowning that left him gasping for air. After several months, Tanaka locked away his research notes and never returned to the project. He went on to have a distinguished academic career focusing on industrial anthropology, but never again ventured into research involving folk beliefs or supernatural elements. When colleagues occasionally asked about his aborted Minamata project, he would change the subject. In 1981, 20 years after the disappearance of the Nakamura twins, a new development brought the old mystery back into focus. A construction project on the outskirts of Minamata uncovered a previously unknown cave system that extended from the cliffs down to the sea. Inside, workers found evidence of habitation, the remains of candles, food wrappers dating back to the 1960s, and most disturbingly, the walls covered with thousands of drawings. The drawings were identical pairs. The same images duplicated side by side, showing progressively more abstract representations of twin figures merging into one. The final images, nearest the underwater entrance to the cave, showed a single figure emerging from what appeared to be a mirror. News of the discovery reached Akio Nakamura, now in her 70s and living in a care home, her mind increasingly lost to dementia. Upon hearing about the cave, she experienced a rare moment of lucidity, insisting on being taken to see it. Against the advice of her doctors, a sympathetic nurse arranged the visit. As Yukio stood in the cave, leaning heavily on her cane, she studied the drawings in silence. Then, to the surprise of those accompanying her, she began speaking as if to someone only she could see. "You found the way," she said, tears streaming down her lined face. "You're together now, aren't you? One soul again, as you always believed." She reached out to touch one of the final drawings, the single figure emerging from the mirror, and then collapsed. She died 3 days later in the hospital, never regaining consciousness. The cave became something of a local legend with various theories emerging about its connection to the long-missing Nakamura twins. Some believed the boys had hidden there after running away, creating the drawings in some sort of psychological fugue state before eventually drowning while trying to swim out through the underwater passage. Others suggested more supernatural explanations, connecting the twins' disappearance to old folklore about spirit portals and the liminality of mirrors. The case might have remained nothing more than a regional curiosity if not for a documentary filmmaker named Hana Ishikawa who came across references to the Nakamura twins while researching the cultural aftermath of the Minamata disaster for a film project in 1991, 30 years after the events. Ishikawa tracked down Dr. Yoshida, now retired and in his 80s, living quietly in Kyoto. Initially reluctant to revisit what he called the greatest failure of my professional life, he eventually agreed to an interview after Ishikawa shared photographs of the cave drawings with him. "I always approached their case from a Western psychological perspective," Dr. Yoshida told her, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the photographs. "I saw their belief in being one soul as a delusion to be cured. But what if they understood something about themselves that our science couldn't explain?" He showed Ishikawa journals he had kept in the years following his departure from Minamata. Detailed accounts of dreams in which he saw the twins swimming through dark water, moving toward a light that seemed to be both a mirror and a doorway. "In the dreams, they're always trying to explain something to me, but I can't hear them properly underwater," he said. "They point to their reflections, then to each other, then to something beyond the mirror that I can't see. They want me to understand what they've discovered." Intrigued by this new perspective, Ishikawa expanded her research. She sought out Kenji Tanaka, who had become a professor emeritus at Tokyo University. He refused an on-camera interview, but agreed to meet privately over tea in his book-lined office. He finally shared the experience that had led him to abandon his research decades earlier. "After I saw whatever it was I saw in that mirror," he told her, his academic demeanor cracking slightly, "I began noticing something when I looked at my own reflection. Just glimpses, mind you, easily dismissed. But sometimes it seemed like my reflection's eyes would look directly at me with an awareness separate from my own, as if something else was looking out from inside the mirror." He leaned forward, lowering his voice despite them being alone. "I believe the Nakamura twins found something. A way of perceiving reality that most of us can't access. Their insistence that they were one soul in two bodies wasn't a childish fantasy or a psychological abnormality. It was an insight." "An insight into what?" Ishikawa asked. Tanaka hesitated. "Into the nature of consciousness, perhaps. Or the permeability of the boundaries we assume exist between separate minds." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know how this sounds. I've spent 40 years trying to rationalize what I experienced. But sometimes I think those twins were right. Not just about themselves, but about all of us. What do you mean? Maybe we're all fragments of something larger, separated only by the limitations of physical form. Maybe what those boys experienced as a literal connection is something the rest of us feel only as a vague intuition. That consciousness isn't as individual as we believe. Ishikawa's documentary project gradually shifted focus from the Minamata disaster to the story of the Nakamura twins. She visited the cave, now partially closed for safety reasons, but still accessible with special permission. She interviewed elderly villagers who remembered the twins, former classmates, and the fishermen who had found the mirror. The mirror itself proved impossible to locate. After Yukio's death, her few possessions had been dispersed among distant relatives, and the antique mirror had apparently been sold to a collector whose identity remained unknown, despite Ishikawa's best efforts to track it down. As her research progressed, Ishikawa began experiencing her own strange phenomena, particularly in relation to mirrors and reflective surfaces. Twice, while filming B-roll footage of Minamata Bay, her camera captured inexplicable reflections on the water's surface. What appeared to be two young men standing behind her, visible in the water, but not on the shore where she stood. When she turned, there was no one there, and the reflections vanished. More unsettling were the dreams that began plaguing her. Vivid nightmares of being underwater, looking up at the surface where two identical faces gazed down at her, their features distorted by the water, but their eyes clear and purposeful. In the dreams, she understood they were trying to show her something, but she always woke before she could grasp what it was. Despite these disturbing experiences, or perhaps because of them, Ishikawa became increasingly determined to understand what had happened to the Nakamura twins. She consulted experts in various fields, psychiatrists specializing in twin studies, folklorists familiar with Japanese beliefs about mirrors as spiritual portals, even quantum physicists whose work touched on theories of consciousness and observer effects. One physicist, Dr. Mio Koto, found the case particularly intriguing from a theoretical perspective. Quantum entanglement suggests that particles once connected remain connected, instantaneously affecting each other regardless of distance, he explained during an interview for the documentary. We observe this with particles, but consciousness remains poorly understood from a quantum perspective. If consciousness has quantum properties, could the unusual connection between identical twins, who develop from a single cell, represent a macro-level form of entanglement? Dr. Koto cautioned that this was speculation far beyond current scientific understanding, but the parallel was suggestive. The Nakamura twins' belief that they were one consciousness experiencing reality through two separate physical forms isn't entirely incompatible with some very theoretical quantum approaches to consciousness, he concluded. As Ishikawa's documentary neared completion in early 1992, she made a final trip to Minamata to film concluding segments at locations central to the twin story. On her last evening there, she visited the tidal pool where the mirror had been found 30 years earlier. The sun was setting, turning the water to rippled gold and orange. As she stood contemplating the case that had consumed more than a year of her life, she noticed something unusual in the water, a perfect reflection of the twilight sky, but with two dark figures standing at its center. Heart racing, she looked up, but there was no one on the cliff above her to cast such reflections. When she looked back at the water, the figures seemed closer, more distinct. Two young men in their early 30s, identical but mirrored, dressed in clothes that might have been fashionable in the 1960s. They were looking directly up at her from beneath the surface, their expressions solemn but not frightening. Ishikawa found herself unable to move, transfixed by the impossible reflection. As she watched, the two figures slowly turned toward each other. They reached out, their hands meeting in the middle of the reflection. Where they touched, their forms began to blur together, the boundaries between them dissolving until, for just a moment, she saw a single figure where two had been. Then the water rippled, disturbed by a sudden breeze, and when it settled, the reflection showed only the darkening sky. Shaken, but also strangely elated, as if she had been given a rare gift, Ishikawa completed her documentary. The film, titled The Mirror Twins, Two Bodies, One Soul, premiered at a small film festival in Tokyo in late 1992. It received positive reviews for its atmospheric storytelling and respectful approach to both scientific and supernatural perspectives, but never achieved mainstream distribution. What few people know is that Ishikawa created two versions of the ending. The version shown publicly concluded with thoughtful commentary from Dr. Kodo and other experts about the mystery of consciousness and connection, leaving viewers to draw their own conclusions about what might have happened to the Nakamura twins. But there was another version, one she showed only to Dr. Yoshida and Professor Tanaka at a private screening. This ending included footage of the tidal pool at sunset, capturing the impossible reflection she had witnessed. The footage was unclear, wavering with the water's movement, but distinct enough to show two figures becoming one before the surface rippled and the image disappeared. Both men watched in silence. When the screen went dark, Dr. Yoshida was weeping quietly. "They found their way back," he said. "They completed their journey." Professor Tanaka simply nodded, beyond words. Ishikawa never showed this footage to anyone else. And after Dr. Yoshida's death in 1994, she decided to destroy it. But before doing so, she had a strange compulsion to film her own reflection in a mirror while holding the videotape. When she watched this recording afterward, she was unsurprised to see subtle movements in her reflection that she hadn't made, her reflected self nodding slightly as if in approval before the image stabilized and showed only her true movements again. The original tape containing the tidal pool footage was never found among her possessions. In her journal, her final entry on the subject simply read, "Some truths exist only in reflections, visible from one side, but not the other." The twins knew this. Now, perhaps so do I. 30 years have passed since Ishikawa's documentary. The story of the Nakamura twins has become a footnote in discussions of the Minamata disaster, occasionally referenced in parapsychological literature or quantum consciousness theory, but largely forgotten by the wider world. But in Minamata itself, now recovered and redeveloped, there are still stories. Fishermen sometimes report seeing two identical young men standing on the shore at dawn, visible only as reflections in the water. Visitors to the cave, now a minor tourist attraction, occasionally claim their reflections in puddles on the cave floor momentarily show different faces, twin young men with serious eyes who seem to be trying to communicate something important. Most notably, a local phenomenon has emerged that remains unexplained despite investigation by meteorologists and geologists. Twice a year, on the spring and autumn equinoxes, the tidal pool where the mirror was found displays unusual reflective properties. For approximately 20 minutes at sunset, the water becomes completely still, regardless of weather conditions, and reflects the sky and surrounding cliffs with mirror-like perfection. Photographers and tourists often gather to witness this phenomenon. In their pictures, the boundary between reality and reflection becomes indistinguishable. The real world and its mirror image forming a perfect whole with no clear line dividing where one ends and the other begins. Local tradition now holds that during these moments the barrier between worlds thins, and it becomes possible to glimpse truths normally hidden from human perception. Some claim to have seen their reflections move independently or to have briefly perceived themselves not as separate individuals but as connected parts of a larger consciousness. Scientists offer various explanations involving unique geological features, unusual tidal patterns, and specific atmospheric conditions. But those who have experienced the phenomenon firsthand often come away changed, more attuned to the subtle connections between themselves and others, more aware of the permeable nature of the boundaries we perceive as solid. As for the Nakamura twins, Akira and Akio, their ultimate fate remains unknown. Did they drown that stormy night in 1961, their bodies carried out to sea? Did they live for a time in the hidden cave before some tragic end? Or did they, as their mother believed in her final moments of lucidity, find the way to become one again, crossing some threshold that exists only in reflection? Perhaps all these stories, the scientific explanations, the folklore, the eyewitness accounts, are themselves reflections of a truth too complex for any single perspective to capture completely. Like mirror twins, they are different yet the same, separate yet connected, each containing elements of truth viewed from different angles. What remains clear is the profound impact of two children who challenged our understanding of identity and consciousness, who believed with unshakable conviction that they were not two separate beings but a single soul experiencing reality through two physical forms. Their story continues to raise questions about the nature of connection, the boundaries of self, and the possibility that our perception of reality as solid and separate is merely a reflection on troubled waters, distorting a deeper unity that lies beneath. As I conclude this episode of the Ghastly Journal, I invite you to consider your own reflection the next time you stand before a mirror. Look carefully into your own eyes and ask yourself, is that truly you looking back, or is there something more complex happening in that moment of recognition? Are you seeing yourself, or are you seeing the reflection of something larger of which you are just one manifestation? The Nakamura twins believed they knew the answer. Perhaps in their own way, they were trying to show us a truth we've forgotten, that the boundaries between us are more permeable than we realize, that consciousness flows between and beyond our physical forms like water finding its level, and that perhaps, somewhere beyond the mirror, they are still waiting for us to understand. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember, every reflection contains two worlds, and the line between them may be thinner than you think.